Yo, what's up, everybody? It is Wednesday, October 26th, 5 days to Halloween. Woo! Market was down today and mostly on weak tech earnings. Happy to report that as of today, that entire September tax drain has been wiped out. In other words, all that money that was drained has been put back into the economy, and I think we got a positive path going forward, at least until mid-December. But today I'm going to answer a viewer's question, and I'm going to do it with a little whiteboard here. I'm sorry, I'm going low tech on this today. I don't feel like doing all the editing and stuff like that, so I'm going to jot it down. But let me read you what a viewer sent me asked me a question, or asked a question on my last video. Can someone explain how QE causes the banks to not meet capital requirements? All right, I'm going to explain it. You know, there's a bunch of regulatory, mandates or regulatory constructs that the banks have to meet. One of them is called the supplemental leverage ratio. And what that is Tier 1 capital divided by consolidated assets. Okay? So this is the leverage ratio. I'm just going to call it LR equals. Leverage ratio is Tier 1 capital, that's the bank's primary capital, over consolidated assets, okay? Assets is the denominator, so that would include, assets include reserves. Reserves are assets, okay? So let's say, for example, a bank, oh, and by the way, that leverage ratio, according to, and this is dictated not just by the Fed, this is the Bank of International Settlements. The Bank of International Settlements is the central bank for all central banks, okay? It's in Basel, Switzerland, and they come up with the rules. They get together, all these central banks and the BIS, and they come up with the rules that all central banks and then what member banks have to adhere to. Okay? So they came up, the leverage ratio has to be 3% or greater. All right, so let me give you an example. Suppose the bank had $10 in capital, right? I'm just using numbers for the sake of explanation, and $100 in consolidated assets. That would give it a leverage ratio of 10%. Got it? $10 in Tier 1 capital, $100 in consolidated assets. That gives it a leverage ratio of 10%, which that would put them, way in compliance. I mean, no problem. They got to be 3%, right? But now, let's say the Fed comes in and starts doing QE. What's QE? They're buying, mostly government securities, treasuries, MBS, agency securities, and they're replacing that with reserves. Now remember, all these securities that they're buying, they don't necessarily belong to the banks. I mean, some of these big Fed member banks, they're primary dealers, I should say all of them, but they're also, they sell securities on behalf of customers. So what happens is that the Fed takes away, it's not like a one-for-one swap. The Fed will take away those securities, but it'll add the reserves to the bank's balance sheet. Okay? So now look what happens. Let's say that goes up to, let's say they add now let's say the QE brings reserves up to 200. So they still have the same capital, $10 in capital, but now they have $200 in reserves. So what's that ratio? That drops down, suddenly that drops down to 5%. Without the banks having to do anything, the Fed just added, a bunch of reserves, and it drops it down to 5%. So the leverage ratio goes down, but they're still in compliance. Follow me so far? It's not that hard. Now let's see what happens. What happens if the Fed goes to, 400? Because it's been doing this for it's been adding trillions and trillions. So now what happens? What happens if the reserve balances cause consolidated assets to go to 400? Okay, what's that ratio? That's 2.5%. They have now fallen below the 3% threshold. You see? They have fallen below the 3% threshold. They're at 2.5%. They didn't do anything. It's the Fed adding reserves onto their balance sheet. So what do they have to do to get back in compliance? Well, either they have to raise capital, right? I mean, if they brought this up to, instead of 10, if they brought it up to 20, right? Let's do that. That would make it if they brought their capital up, that would put them back in compliance. Now they're at 5%. But how do they bring their capital up? They got to sell stock. Dilutes their stock. Okay? This is what's been happening to bank stocks. Or there's another thing that they could do. All right, let's go back to the original example where they don't add more capital. Sorry that this thing is getting blurry. I'm moving around. It's autofocus. Let's keep it at 10. Their capital is 10, but let's say now if they liquidate some assets, let's say they liquidate, instead of 400, they take it down to 300. Okay? All right, so they liquidated some assets. What could they liquidate? They could liquidate treasury. Mostly they'll probably liquidate treasury, agency, MBS. That's what they've been doing. If they take their assets down to 300, that gives them a 3.3333. They're back in compliance, okay? But that means they got to sell off some assets. Maybe they'll close some loans. Maybe they'll call in some loans, or maybe they won't lend as much. Maybe they were anticipating a certain amount of loan growth. Now they can't because they're right up against that leverage ratio. So you see, that's how it works. The Fed when it does QE, it adds assets to the bank's balance sheet without the banks even asking for it. Basically, they're not asking for it. I mean, there have been surveys, literally, folks, I got to tell you something. The Fed itself, here's another crazy thing if you want to think about it. The Fed itself has surveyed the banks. In other words, asked the banks, what's an ideal level of reserve balances for you? And they're like 600 billion, it was 600 billion a couple of years ago in that survey that they did. But they need to have 10%, figure 10% of deposits. So they need 1.7 trillion to just be, in compliance with the Fed's mandate on reserve ratios. But the Fed has 3 trillion and it was over 4 trillion. The banks don't want that. They don't need that. It just sits there on their balance sheet. Now they don't mind having that so much because they're getting paid pretty soon they're going to be getting paid 3.75 to 4%. 4% on 3 trillion, actually it's more. It's almost like 5.5 trillion because you got reserves in the RRP, in the reverse repo facility. So 4% on 5.5 trillion, that's over 200 billion. That's 220 billion of free money. Now they don't mind it so much. And by the way, that free money that the Fed is going to be adding to the banks because the Fed is paying reserves, at a high interest rate, that's just going to go right to bank capital. That's like free money. That's like somebody coming by, knocking on your door and saying, here's a bucket of money. Just take it. No questions asked. It's all yours. How about that? Would you like that? Yeah, well, the banks are liking that too. And that really the only constraint, let me tell you this because it's very important. People think that banks lend out reserves, make loans with their reserves. They don't do that. They might lend excess reserves to each other like overnight, just for clearing purposes, but they don't lend out reserves. Reserves just sit on their balance sheet. The only constraint to bank lending, the only constraint to a bank's ability to make loans is their capital, okay? If you go into a bank and you talk to the loan officer, hey, I want to borrow whatever, $40,000 for a car or $35,000 for a car. I want to buy a house. I want to borrow $300,000 or something like that. He doesn't call down to the reserve desk, hey, do we have enough reserves to lend to this guy? No, they make the loan based on your creditworthiness, your ability to pay it back. Even if they don't have enough reserves to cover. What happens in that case? What happens if a bank doesn't have enough reserves to cover its loans? Remember, they need that 10-to-1 ratio. Then they get an overdraft. They have accounts at the Fed. They get an overdraft in their account, just like at your bank. If you spend too much or send out too many checks, you get an overdraft. But the Fed automatically covers the overdraft, and they have a 2-week period to make good on the overdraft. I mean, most banks don't do that for people, right? You get a $35 freaking charge in most cases. But the Fed will automatically, so when the loan is made, it literally creates new reserves because the Fed will ultimately add reserves to cover any overdrafts by the banks. They got a cushy situation. Anyway, I hope that answers the question, folks. I mean, the Fed, this QE is a mess. I mean, I could understand it in cases. We had a case in 2019, where here's another thing, and I've spoken about this in the past, how I hate to use this language, dumb and stupid and just not paying attention, but like they were doing QT back then too, and they took reserve balances in the system below the threshold that the Fed mandates. So the Fed itself, remember yesterday, and I've been telling you how the Fed is doing things policy-wise that puts the banks in jeopardy of the Fed's own regulations. Like the Fed will say, okay, you got to conform to this and this and this. The banks are, okay, fine. If that's what we need to operate as a bank, okay, well, we'll play by the rules. And then the Fed will engage in this policy that puts them in jeopardy of violating their own rules. It's craziness. So what happened in 2019, there was something like 13 trillion in deposits. Okay, now there's like 17, 18 trillion. And if you count what's in the reverse repo, it's like 20 trillion. Because there's been a lot of talk recently about, oh my God, deposits are going down. It's even I might have even mentioned it, but they're not really going down. They're in that reverse repo facility because again, the banks, they don't want it. They can't take it on because of what the Fed has done. Anyway, In 2019, get this, it's another one of these cockamamie ridiculous situations. Hang on. All right. In 2019, when deposits in the system were 13 trillion, the Fed conducting operations, at that time it was QT, right? Quantitative, they call it tightening. It's not really a tightening. It's when they exchange securities for reserves. They're taking out reserves. They're giving the banks back the securities, collateral, basically. They took reserve balances, so with 13 trillion in deposits, if you have to have a 10 to 1, a 10% reserve to deposit ratio, the system needed 1.3 trillion to be in compliance with the Fed's rules. Okay? It doesn't really need 1.3 trillion, like it could operate without that, but the Fed makes a rule saying, okay, you got to have 10% on reserve compared to your deposits. So deposits were 13 trillion, right? So in order for the system, the banking system, to be in compliance with the Fed's rule, the banking system had to have 1.3 trillion. But the Fed took it down below 1.3 trillion. And all of a sudden, everybody, all these banks had to borrow reserves. So it was like one bank borrowing, Bank A borrowing from Bank B borrowing from Bank C. The next thing you know, the overnight interest rate was going up like crazy. That's the Fed's target rate. Like the Fed didn't even understand, what are they on automatic pilot and not even paying attention. Or it's not automatic pilot, asleep at the wheel. They took reserve balances down below their own mandated threshold. They put the whole system into like non-compliance, where every bank, or some banks, had to borrow reserves like crazy to stay in compliance, pushing up the overnight rate. And everybody was like, what's going on? There's a liquidity crisis. Yeah, because the idiots at the Fed navigated that. I mean, come on, folks, seriously. I mean, it's like every day I give you these stories. I'm not making them up. This stuff really happened. You got to be sitting there right now and like, seriously? Yeah, this is what's going on. So anyway, that's it. That's the reason for why the QE is problematic. I hope that explains it. Sorry again for the very low-tech presentation, but it's just a little simple math. I figured no big deal. You guys will get it. All right, bye.